The 4 pillars of UX, according to CMO Jon Myers, is the following: empathy, utility, aesthetic, and value. I'm interviewing him. We're talking about the 4-stage process and a couple of other things. But first, who is Jon Myers? He's a co-founder of a crypto exchange.
My name is Jon Myers. I've been practicing UX, UI design for over 20 years. I've worked in a number of different domains, including finance, crypto, biotech, difficult domains. Currently the co-founder of a crypto exchange called PowerTrade. So we tackle all kinds of very difficult design problems to serve the needs of traders.
I've seen his work a couple of times and I really respect what he achieved, especially for the crypto exchange. Jon is, by the way, the person who's always criticizing my slides here. And I've seen a lot of his work and I was very curious what we can learn from him in terms of how to structure design process. So he told me about his 4 pillars of UX.
The design process that we were talking about last week is more of my mental model about design. And so it breaks down into, in my mind, 4 different stages. And so the first sort of stage of design in my mind is empathy. And that's one big pillar. And what that actually means is having an empathic, deep understanding of the users that your design is serving, and thus your product. And so when you're in this stage of empathy, that's when you're doing your user personas, you're getting deep psychographic information, and that's sort of all coming together to inform this empathic profile of whom you're designing for. So 1, empathy. Then the second one is utility. And utility, the way I think about that is more, that's when you start to get more into UX, right? So utility is what is the purpose of the application you're actually designing, and how does it serve the utilitarian objectives of those users that you have a deep empathic understanding of at this point in the design process. So the utility stage, what you're doing is you're creating assets that gain cooperation and buy-in of how the application actually works to serve those users. And that's where you're thinking about how it works. And then the third stage of that would be aesthetic. And so I think a lot of people get confused about aesthetic because they think it just means how it looks. But really, what you're doing at the aesthetic stage is based on your empathic understanding of the user, based on your agreement with other stakeholders of how it works to serve that user. That's when you're starting to bring together the aesthetic elements that form the basis of your design. And so those aesthetic elements could be color, your typographic system, your grid system, all your elements. And what you're doing is, the way I kind of think about it, it's like notes in a song. And so everything has to be balanced, it has to be in key, and you have to bring those elements together to serve the utilitarian function of your application that ultimately serves your user. Then the 4th pillar is the value matrix. And so basically with value, what you're thinking about is, does the user actually get value from the application that you've created based on what you understand about them and based on the utilitarian objective of your application?
How is it different to the utility? To point number 2, point number 4?
Value is the sort of, that's the destination you arrive at from actually using the application. So is it delivering some type of value? And also in the value equation as well, is the business getting value from that, right? So, if the business doesn't derive value, then it's not sustainable. And then obviously, if the user doesn't derive value from that application, then, it's not going to be that useful as well. So those 4 things, so empathy, utility, aesthetic, value.
First pillar, empathy. We're talking about user personas, psychographics, and competitive analysis. But why is it important to understand the users, and what does Jon do in order to understand them?
Typically, I'll use Notion and just document my user personas in Notion. I'll share those personas with other stakeholders to get agreement on that's who we're serving and why. You might, and when I've been in larger organizations, you invite in data analysts and other people that are going to enrich some of that data and findings. But for that stage, it's usually simple. For me, I like to have really clear targets on who we're designing for. So the deeper you can go in the personas, the deeper you can go in the psychographics and demographics and that type of stuff, I think it's better because it gives you clarity. So by the time you've been through the empathy stage and the utility stage, those things will sort of start to be self-evident, right? So the design starts to show itself. So one reason people get sort of like designer's block is because they're jumping straight to high fidelity, but they haven't really thought through clearly, who is the user and what's their needs. So it makes the other steps a lot clearer.
What else is there in terms of understanding the user?
You'll do a lot of competitive analysis. I think one thing people do, which is pretty common at this particular stage of the design process, is they sort of build like a competitor matrix and who's our competitors and that sort of thing, which is good. Obviously you need to know the competition inside and out. But where I think people screw up at that stage is they're all very literal at that stage. And the problem with that approach is that you're going to get the same exact result. And so what I like to do at that beginning stage is, once you have those cohorts identified for whom you're serving, you can start to look at other parallel industries that might be doing things better. So for example, in crypto, most crypto applications are quite primitive, and the product design acumen is kind of at a medium level, I would say. Whereas in fintech, there's higher product acumen. So you might start to look at sort of parallel industries at that stage of the process to inform your approach overall.
Now that's something I'm more familiar with. As a software developer, I have used those tools, but I'm very curious how Jon is applying those tools in the design process.
So I'll tend to do custom flow maps in Figma. That's a big one. Figma Jamboards. We've used Miro for that type of stuff. Any type of rapid sort of iteration tool where you can sort of visually start to represent your ideas. And so in that case, you would also start to invite other stakeholders in, or other stakeholders might actually be driving this process depending on the makeup of the organization. So you might have, I've worked with product managers that sort of, take hold of this process, and even the, first persona process as well. That can be within the realm of a product manager. So typically when you're sort of doing the utility stage, you'll go through that. Also things like Airtable, where you're sort of just mapping out, for example, at that stage, if you're mapping out your flows and that sort of thing, then you want to start to take inventory of all your screens and that sort of thing. So I start to think about what's the inventory of assets that are needed to achieve this product, this design. It's a mistake I see a lot of people make, is they jump ahead once you've passed empathy and you're focused on utility and doing all your UX and all that. The biggest mistake people make at this stage is they start thinking about how it looks. And I see that all the time when you create these assets, is people will go, well, no, I don't want it to look like that. That's not the point at this stage of the game, right? So that shouldn't even be a conversation about how it looks. You're only focused on how it works. And so what I've done in the past in that stage is it's kind of like playing poker. I'm a poker player. And so what you do, if I find that I have very difficult stakeholders, so for example, I've had really tough, all male, old school stakeholders. So sometimes what I've done in that stage is I've created flow maps and assets with the specific intention of disarming them. So I might put it in all pink. just to really drive home the point. This is not supposed to be focused, but in that case, it would be a bit of a distraction. So I would kind of tone down from that.
And Jon had also another story about utility.
I'll give you another sort of story that is another sort of custom way you can get through certain bottlenecks. So when I was working on the bank, again, we had a very complicated KYC process for signing up to the bank. So for people that don't know that out there, KYC means know your customer. And so what that means is every time you sign up for a bank, you have to answer a bunch of questions. You have to give a government issued ID. You have to provide a proof of address document. They ask you all these questions. And so the stakeholders, so at this stage also, you're starting to gather all your data, all your inputs, and that sort of thing that's going to inform your designs, right? That's also part of this process. So when we were designing the KYC process for the bank, all the stakeholders wanted the users to complete like 30 pages worth of questions in the mobile app, to KYC. And I thought that was insane. And so what I did in that case is I actually just prototyped all the forms in Google Forms. And then I showed up at the next meeting and I asked everyone to bring out their phones and I gave them the URL for this. And I asked them to complete it and I was going to time them. And they all gave up after 2 minutes and said, forget about it. And here was the kicker as well. So in this particular country, in this particular region, to KYC, you need a liveness test. So you need to go into the bank anyways. So they were taxing the user with this 30 screens of stuff to fill out. And then they have to go into the bank anyways. So I was able to get them to see the error in that way by using this approach with the form. And then what we did is we actually designed a custom KYC process for this bank. And so we totally turned that around. So we created a custom application on the iPad. There was representatives in the bank that were gathering that. So we turned it into a retail experience for KYC. So we totally turned that around. That was all started with Google Forms.
Now, aesthetic is something we are usually just always giving to the UX designer to execute on their own. But of course, it's important as a developer to also know something about this. Very interesting what Jon had to say about this, because I have seen Jon's design I've always seen them as very clean, very minimalistic, and there is a lot of thought behind this.
I typically start with two things. One is typography, and the other is grid. And so I just start to think very basic, so I start to set up I start to think about the typographic system. I start to think about the grid system and the layout and those kinds of things. Because if you think about it, the primary function of most applications, people are either reading text or they're composing or manipulating text in some way. So your typography is really important. And then obviously how it's laid out on the screen and your typographic scale and those kinds of things are quite critical. But then the pieces of your design system start to take shape in the aesthetic phase, so you're building components typically. I like to kind of start at the component level and start to build out components that will eventually start to form the basis of the layouts and the design.
And lastly, it is super important to continuously know if the user gets the value out of it. Do they get an ROI on their time or in their investment? So we're talking about how to figure that out.
You might not have anything to validate. So, and these aren't necessarily nice clean pillars. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to validate your product hypotheses. So you might not have anything for people to even react to. So this would be your user testing. That's where that stuff starts to come in. Talking to users. You're talking about beta users, user surveys. When I was chief design officer at Liquid, I did a lot of in-person sessions with users and just sat with them and talk through about how they use the application and that sort of thing. And this was in Japan, and that's a very unique market as well. So at that stage, that's when you're really starting to validate those hypotheses in the first place.
Well, I learned a lot already, but is there any last advice that Jon wants to share with us?
I think the more custom the more tailored to your product your KPIs are, that are tailored to sort of the user journey, that's when you're going to sort of validate how well the product works. So for example, in the example of a trading application, you have a sort of user flow, right? So you have top of funnel where someone's going to sign up, then you have download an application or create an account. That would be sort of a next stage. Then the user makes their first deposit, they make their first trade, they make their first withdrawal. And so you have all these different valleys of death in the customer journey. So in the case of a trading application, a valley of death would be between account creation and creating a first deposit, right? So like what you're trying to do is you're trying to guide the user to that action as quick as possible in order to have to get them to the aha moment of using your product, which would be the first trade.
Just today, he told me about his newsletter, so please check it out on jonmyers.com. And if you want to know more about the software development process, this video will help you along.